Hi everyone, welcome to Dot Point PS1, and today we're looking at outlining the importance of farms in the wider agribusiness sector of the Australian economy. So first of all, let's start with looking at what an agribusiness is. And basically, an agribusiness is any business that gets some or all of its income from agriculture. So obviously farms are the main one, but you're going to include anything else that has something to do with ag or has involvement in ag or those kind of things. So examples are banks, supermarkets, butchers, transport companies, vets, all these kind of businesses are all agribusinesses because part of their income comes from agriculture. So for this dot point, we need to understand how that fits into the Australian economy. So that will mean things like the places of farms within the agriculture sector, how big the agriculture economy is compared to the Australian economy, and also the effect that agriculture has on local community and also the people that it employs, etc. So by the end of this, you should be able to do past HSC questions and answer the past HSC question at the end. So in terms of agriculture and the economy, basically you can use the textbook for this section, but if you look back at throughout history in Australia, agriculture has been a significant part of the Australian economy. So let's say 100 years ago, it was a much, much higher percentage. You're talking maybe 40, 50% of the Australian economy or more. And so Australia was said to be riding on the sheep's back, quote unquote, because our fortunes fluctuated with the price of wool and the price of lamb. And we had lots of sheep. Lamb production was one of our main enterprises and also exports in Australia. And it was a big part of our economy. So it was really said that the Australian economy was heavily dependent on sheep. That's not the case today, but we'll talk about that in a sec. So Australian agriculture is worth about $50 billion, and this is the farm gate price. So this means basically the price that the farmers get paid at the farm gate, which is why it's called farm gate price. Traditionally, farmers would have been paid, when a delivery driver picked up a amount of product and they would have been paid in cash, but obviously that doesn't happen now. But the farm gate price is the amount of the raw product, the value of the raw product as it moves off farms. But once it's been processed, obviously through an abattoir, if we're talking about animals, and then it's been value added in some kind of way, like we know that in terms of meat, value adding would be things off farm, would be things like making sausages, vacuum packing, adding marinades, things like that. All these different things you can do to add value off farm. By the time that $50 billion worth of produce has been value added, it ends up being worth $155 billion by the time it's sold to the actual consumer that eats it. So the consumer is paying $155 billion for $50 billion worth of produce that's been either raw or value added. And so basically that all up, agriculture is a small part of the economy, but the actual, all the things that happen after the farm as well are worth quite a bit, are worth about 10% of our economy, the value adding part. And so agriculture in total is worth about 12% of our economy, agriculture plus the value adding of the products that come from agriculture. So because we are such a large country with such a small population, over 2/3 of our produce that we produce in Australia is exported. So we're a major exporter of a lot of things, particularly things like wheat and beef, which we produce a lot of. We produce a lot more than we need in Australia due to our low population relative to our size. So we export, as I said, 2/3 of our produce. And so we produce about 2.3% of the world's agricultural exports. Of the produce that gets sent around the world to other countries, 2.3% of it is produced by Australia. And then lastly here, Australian agriculture can feed over 60 million people, and we only have a population of 24 million. And so obviously, as we mentioned, that leads to a significant export industry. If we look at this figure here, this shows the percentage of the Australian economy that agriculture is. So we have agriculture and forestry and fishing here. It's roughly here. And you can see that that's about 2.5 to 3% roughly of the Australian economy is agricultural and fishing and forestry. And remember, we said before that 12% is 12% of the economy is all the value adding that happens on raw agricultural products. So what's happened to this over the last 100 years? Basically, it's dropped significantly. So like I said before, the percentage of the Australian economy that agriculture was significantly higher 50, 100 years ago. And it's dropped significantly. And that's not because we're producing less. So the answer to why here is while the total dollars of agricultural production has increased, so we're actually producing more than we ever have in dollars terms, and also quantity and tons, etc. All other areas of the Australian economy have grown much faster. So all these things below: mining, manufacturing, electricity, construction, financial services, all these things have all grown very large compared to agriculture. And so now they are taking up large parts of the Australian economy, whereas agriculture, while it has grown in dollar value every year, it has backed off in terms of total percentage. In terms of this graph here, we're looking at a number of years, so about 10 years here along the bottom, and it's showing the value of Australian agriculture over those years. And you can see that it's obviously highly variable. It's going from maybe a high here of 32 billion down to 25, up, down, etc. And then the last few years that are on this graph, up to 37 billion or so. And so obviously it's fluctuating significantly. So basically this graph shows fluctuation from year to year, and there's many reasons, but two reasons I've written here are, number one, obviously climate effects, and a specific example is drought. So a lack of water is obviously going to reduce yields, and it's going to have less pasture for animals to graze on, and this is then going to decrease yields and then hence income. And so clearly getting more rain is going to help increase the amount of dollars that you make. That's another reason why is Australia produces a lot of wheat and beef. So in years where the wheat and beef prices drop, our income's going to drop from those things. And in the years when it increases, potentially our income is going to increase from that. So that's an example there. This is showing the top 8 agricultural exports from Australia. We've got wheat and beef as our number 1 and 2. You can see here that, and this is just in a particular year that was in the textbook. Obviously, it fluctuates year to year, but you can see it's $6 to $7 billion roughly for wheat. Beef is around $4 to $5 billion. Cotton is around about 2 to 3, and then wool is quite close there, and other meat excluding beef as well. And the wine, oilseeds, and barley are also quite high. All right, in terms of farms in Australia, so farms make up about 51 or so percent of the land mass in Australia. So out of the entire continent, over 51% of that is farmed and used for agricultural purposes. And then agriculture accounts for 52% of water usage. So farms obviously vary in size from small farms that are maybe 5 hectares and maybe might be a nursery on the edge of cities, up to farms that are over 20,000 hectares and more even in places like South Australia, Queensland and Northern Territory. So over the years, amalgamations of farms have actually led to less farms. So there isn't as many farms as there used to be. There used to be a lot of family farms, very small ones, but they haven't all been able to compete very well with large farms. So a lot of them have gone out of business and they've been bought by other family farms or maybe corporate farms, and they then get larger. So that means that even though we're farming roughly the same amount of land, maybe a little bit less than we used to, we actually have more farms, but these farms are larger and they're producing just as much, in fact, more produce than ever before. And we'll look at that shortly. So 88% of land, of agricultural land, so 88% of the 50-ish percent is used for grazing, and the majority of farms are family owned. So at least 90% of farms are family owned. So family owned farms, family run farms are really still the absolute majority, and there's very few corporate farms comparatively. So around 5% of corporate farms, and the rest are basically kind of a mix between the two. We have a kind of combined family and corporate farm. And so most production obviously comes from family farms. This is important here as well. The number of farms in Australia is, you can see here. So there's obviously 40,000 or so in New South Wales, 30,000 or so in Victoria, and then it drops off down here as a percentage. So there's about 122,000 farms. Of course, if you remember, roughly 120,000 farms, of which 90% of those are family farms. So let's say 110,000 or so are family farms. Now, this graph on the right here shows the total area of land that we've been farming in Australia. And you can see it has dropped over, say, the last 20 or so years. But it hasn't significantly dropped. I mean, it's dropped from maybe 460 down to about 390. So it has dropped a small amount, maybe 10, 15%. There's years when it goes up, but and that obviously depends on the climatic features, drought, and etc. It's not a major decline, but we need to change this. So because of things like salinity, this is probably being caused by salinity and erosion and things like that. We really need to reverse this and be producing on more land, not less. But we also need to become more efficient. And so if we're producing on less land, we still need to be able to produce as much, if not more, food. So what change do you notice here? Obviously, the amount of land area in Australia under agricultural production has dropped by about 10% since 94. Why do you think there's been a change? And basically, the increased land degradation, such as salinity and erosion, is probably the main reason, but it's also possible there's climatic features as well. So what does it mean we need to do with an increasing population? So obviously we need to become more efficient at using the land to produce more per hectare. This is important here. We need to use technology and better genetic modification and plant breeding and things like that to be able to produce more yield per hectare if we're using less land. We also need to increase land area really by solving issues around salinity and erosion. So if this drop-off is being caused by salinity erosion, then we need people to fix that problem. In terms of impact of agriculture on local community, we'll split it into economic and ecological impact. First of all, the economic impact on local communities is that farmers buy goods and services from the local community. So local towns, the development of local towns and local communities occur because there's businesses in the area that are making money, and agribusinesses are the ones that are producing the products, making the produce, and therefore bringing money into the community from outside. And so really there's a large economic impact from farms that occurs, and it causes the growth of regional areas in where that production is occurring. And so other agribusinesses benefit from that, such as banks and butchers and things like that. In terms of the ecology or environment, poor farm practices can obviously affect the environment, such as pesticide spray drift, and also deterioration of soil quality, such as salinity and erosion. So that's just two impacts that farms have on their community. In terms of agriculture as a consumer, obviously farms to run need to consume goods and services, and so that helps keep communities functioning. In towns, you have shops and Bunnings and various other places that sell things to farms, and so that keeps those people in jobs and those companies functioning as well. So farms also purchase land, labour, fertiliser, water, electricity, chemicals and machinery, etc. And so that sustains the local community. And then also farm workers who are employed on farms and get paid by farms also purchase things like food and cars and clothes, etc. In terms of the rural workforce, so it's reduced significantly. This is an important thing to remember. So from about 400,000 in 1996 to about 20 years later, we have almost halved the number of people that are working on farms. Now, the number of people working in agriculture off farm is going up significantly, but the number of people working on farms doing manual labor has gone down. And the reason really is because there's been a significant increase in automation and mechanization. So there's been a significant amount of technology that's reduced the amount of jobs and labor needed, and that's obviously made it more efficient, made things cheaper to produce, but it's meant less people on farms as a result, and less people in country towns. So the result of less family farms and larger farms and more automation is that there's less people in country towns. And there's a question on that shortly. The next thing is the farm-dependent economy, so flow-on employment into other agribusinesses, employs over 1.6 million people. So this is obviously incredibly large. All of the people that are involved in producing farm product on farm, and then all the things that happen to that product after the farm until it gets to the consumer, including, chefs and cooks and people actually getting the product to consumer in all kinds of ways. People in supermarkets. There's over 1.6 million people employed in what we'd call farm-dependent economy. So they rely on the products that farms produce to live and for a job for these 1.6 million people. So an increased cost of labour in Australia. So this is important here. Australia has a very, very high labour cost. So we pay people, over $20 an hour. Whereas in a lot of other countries nearby in Asia, you can get people to work for a couple of dollars per day. So the difference is, say, almost $200 a day versus $2 a day in labour costs. So clearly it costs us a lot more to do anything manually. And so a lot of farm work can be quite manual. However, of course, people have mechanised a lot of things and there's a lot of technology. And so Australia really is at the forefront of using technology and mechanisation to remove or reduce the cost of labour, because in Australia it is so high. So there's been basically, as a result of all this, there's been a steady drift of people from rural areas to cities. There's less and less people living in the rural areas because there's no jobs, because lots of things have been automated on farms. And as we've said before, a lot of the jobs in agriculture now are in the city, science kind of jobs that will help improve plant breeding, improve animal breeding, stuff like that. So if we have a look at this graph here, it shows the average age of farmers, and from say 40 years ago in the 70s to a projected kind of 2030, the average age of farmer has increased significantly. So going from kind of 40 something to probably peaking at about 53 here. So basically there's been a significant increase in the average age of farmers, which may be a bad thing. So why do you think there's been a change? Basically, there's a high cost to getting into farming, as you need to own the land, and farmers are not retiring until later due to living longer, being healthier for longer, more mechanization, and not needing to do as much manual labor. So farmers will keep working for longer, but it also costs a lot to buy a farm. So there's not many people that get into farming unless they get handed the property from their parents. The next one here, what is the problem with this? So older farmers in general, and this is a generality, but older farmers tend to be less willing to try new techniques and technologies to be more efficient. So having a higher average age here could be a bit of a barrier to using new technology. So if the average age was something further down here, you might see more technology used, more innovative cutting edge methods used by farmers on farms, because they're more willing to try new things. Okay, so this is the next question, or this is a past HSC question. This one's from 2012, question 8, multiple choice. The number of family farms in Australia has declined markedly over the past 100 years, which we just saw. What is the most likely consequence of this change? Reduced total agricultural output. That has not occurred, as we saw. Increased food prices. That's not true, because food prices really have gone down in Australia relatively. Reduced population in small rural towns. This is the answer. And as we said before, because there's less jobs, more automation on farms, there's less people in rural areas and less reduced populations. And then less variety in agricultural commodities. That's not true, because there's just as much stuff as ever. Now, this is really a large 6-mark question on this dot point from the 2011 past HSC paper. It says this: analyze the structure of the Australian agribusiness sector, including a comparison of the importance of the family farm with other components of this sector. So really, this question actually covers 2 dot points, which is why I haven't answered it here. It's important that you go and look at PS2, and I've answered it there. So basically this first part of the question is the first dot point, and the second part of the question is the second dot point. So analyze the structure of the Australian agribusiness sector is really what we've just done. But you need to know the next dot point to be able to answer the rest of this question, which is including a comparison of the importance of the family farm with other components of this sector. So if you have a look at the next video, you'll be able to see an answer to this.